A scientist feeding a crocodile she had raised for years, a routine act she had done countless times. But this morning, something went horribly wrong. In seconds, the enormous reptile lunged, dragging her into the pit. By the time her coworkers arrived, only a horrifying scene remained. This is the gruesome final story of Deasy Tuwo, and the predator she thought she knew. Dawn slid over the Pearl Farm like a blade, cold, bright, unforgiving. Deasy Tuwo should have been there first, like always. Instead, sandals by the desk, a clipboard balanced on its corner, a feed bucket tipped on its side, meat scattered across cement like someone had been interrupted mid-breath. A ripple shivered through the crocodile pit, then another. Too heavy for wind. They crowded the rail. The water was the color of old glass, scummed at the edges, unbroken but for the slow, deliberate rise of a thing that owned the pool. Mary, 4.5 meters of prehistoric muscle, surfaced in increments. Nostrils, eyes, the armored ridge of his skull. In his jaws, something pale. Fabric drifted up and kissed the wall. Familiar print, familiar sleeve. Recognition landed like a blow. Someone yelled her name. Another stumbled back and retched. No one moved closer. Mary shifted, the massive tail riding violence beneath the surface. The water cupped and fell. The thing in his bite dipped and rose, claimed. Poles appeared, clanged against metal. A net was dragged from a hook with shaking hands, then abandoned. Every instinct said, do something. Every survival sense screamed, don't go in. The morning filled with the wrong sounds. Radios stuttering, a prayer half-spoken, the hollow ring of aluminum on concrete. The crocodile did not spook. He held his position like a fortress, eyes half-lidded, as if daring anyone to argue with the oldest law on Earth. By the time sirens began to thread the air from the road, the truth had already settled over the pit, heavy and final. The enclosure Deasy fed every day had become the place she would never leave. Before the horror, there was the quiet rhythm of her life. Deasy Tuwo was 44, a scientist devoted to marine biology, known among her colleagues for her gentle nature and an almost mystical patience with animals. To her, the Pearl Farm wasn't just a job, it was a place of devotion. She lived in the shadow of the mountains in North Sulawesi, rising before dawn, keeping detailed notes, feeding creatures that most people would never dare approach. And at the heart of her daily routine was Mary, the colossal crocodile she helped raise. 14.5 feet long, weighing nearly half a ton, an apex predator confined in a pit. To outsiders, he was nothing but danger incarnate. To Deasy, he was part of the farm, a responsibility she never turned away from. Coworkers often marveled at how close she'd lean over the railing when tossing down meat. They teased that she trusted Mary too much, but she always brushed it off. "Respect them, feed them, and they'll respect you back," she'd say with quiet conviction. But trust is a fragile bridge to walk across when the other side is ruled by an animal whose instincts were carved in the age of dinosaurs. For years, Deasy crossed that bridge every morning, never imagining that one day, a slip, a misstep, or a moment's imbalance would tilt her whole world into his. Her life, measured in scientific notes, careful feedings, and soft-spoken laughter, was about to collide with nature's rawest truth, that for a predator like Mary, there is no bond, only opportunity. That morning, as she approached the pit with her bucket of meat, her colleagues later recalled, nothing felt unusual. No warning signs, no omen. Just another feeding, just another day. Mary was no ordinary crocodile. At 4.4 meters long and weighing more than half a ton, he was a living relic of deep time, a predator honed by millions of years of evolution. His skull alone was powerful enough to snap bone like twigs, and his jaw pressure was measured in thousands of pounds per square inch. For comparison, it was stronger than that of a great white shark. And yet, despite his size and ferocity, Mary lived his days in confinement, a concrete pit with murky water, high walls that kept him from the wild rivers of Indonesia, where he would have been king. Instead, his kingdom was a cage, one that fueled both fascination and fear among the workers who tended the Pearl Farm. Most avoided the enclosure unless absolutely necessary. They spoke of the way Mary would stare for minutes without moving, only his eyes breaking the surface of the water. It was not the vacant gaze of a farm animal, but the calculating stillness of a hunter, waiting for the smallest mistake. Rumors spread too, that Mary was never legally acquired, that his very presence on the farm was the shadow of someone's vanity project. Some whispered he had already killed before, in the wild or in captivity. Nothing was proven, but the sheer size of him was enough to unsettle anyone who stood too close. Yet Deasy approached him with a calmness that baffled her peers. To her, Mary was not a monster. He was simply another life to care for. But behind those prehistoric eyes was no friendship, no affection, only instinct, hardwired and merciless. Mary had been waiting his whole life in that pit, confined and restless. And on that January morning, fate would tilt in his favor. It was a routine Deasy had done countless times before. The sun barely lifted over the Pearl farm, casting long shadows across the concrete walls of the Crocodile enclosure. In her hands was a tray of raw meat, glistening crimson in the humid Indonesian air. Each chunk was heavy with blood and fat, the only thing that could sate a predator like Mary. She climbed the steps to the enclosure edge, careful but confident. Workers had seen her do this many mornings. Lean over the pit, toss down the meat, and watch as the enormous reptile surged from the water with shocking speed. For most, even standing near the enclosure was unnerving. But Deasy seemed fearless, almost detached, as though feeding a 4.4-meter apex predator was no different than tossing kibble to a dog. Below, Mary stirred. His vast body broke the surface in slow motion, the ridged tail cutting awake, his eyes locked upward. He didn't lunge immediately. He never did. He waited, calculating, watching the figure above lean closer with each throw. Every feeding carried with it a silent gamble. The lip of the enclosure wall was narrow, slick with damp. A single slip, a moment of imbalance, could be the difference between safety and catastrophe. And on this morning, as Deasy leaned just a little too far, the gamble tipped toward horror. One misstep. A foot shifted, weight slid forward, and gravity took her. In a heartbeat, she was no longer the feeder. She was the prey, plunging into the concrete pit where Mary waited. The feeding ritual had just become a death sentence. The fall was only seconds long, but to Deasy it must have felt eternal. The tray of meat spun from her hands, scattering crimson pieces across the concrete floor as she plummeted into the enclosure. She hit the ground hard. The air punched from her lungs, leaving her stunned, vulnerable. And then came the silence. A silence broken only by the slow ripple of water as Mary, the 4.4-meter crocodile, began to move. He had ignored the meat now scattered across the pit. His predator's gaze was fixed entirely on her. In that moment, instinct took over. Deasy scrambled, desperate to climb back up, her hands clawing at the slick wall, feet slipping against concrete too steep to escape. Above her, the edge of safety was only a few feet away, but might as well have been miles. Mary closed the distance with terrifying precision. No rush, no wasted energy, just a sudden burst of primal force. With jaws capable of exerting thousands of pounds of pressure, he lunged upward, clamping down not on meat, but on flesh. The impact was violent. A single thrash, a brutal snap, and Deasy's world went dark as she was dragged toward the water's edge. The hunter had claimed her, and inside that pit, there was no way out. Mary did not hesitate. The enormous crocodile clamped its jaws tighter around Deasy's body and pulled her across the floor with terrifying ease. The sound of her screams was swallowed by the walls of the pit, muffled beneath the guttural growl of the predator. Then came the move every victim fears, the death roll. In an instant, Mary dragged her into the shallow water and spun violently, his massive body twisting with devastating force. The roll tore through her, bones snapping, flesh ripping, the water around them churning into froth. Every thrash pushed her further from life, each rotation designed not only to kill, but to consume. Deasy tried to fight back, instinct clawing at her to survive. But there is no resisting a crocodile of that size. At 4.4 meters and over 1,300 pounds, Mary was a killing machine, his entire body engineered for this exact moment. The pit became a blur of blood and water, her cries fading under the relentless violence. Above, The farm lay silent. Coworkers unaware of the horror unfolding just meters away. When the spinning stopped, Mary's jaws tightened, and then he dragged her fully beneath the water. His victim now powerless, the attack mercilessly complete. The next morning, the Pearl Farm stirred awake like any other day. Workers arrived expecting routine tasks, feeding fish, maintaining tanks, preparing shipments. But as they approached the crocodile pit, something immediately felt wrong. The air was heavy. The water inside the enclosure, usually still, rippled with an eerie calm. And Mary, his immense, scaled body, floated partially above the surface, eyes cold, unblinking, jaws still stained with something dark. Then, one of the workers spotted it. A shape in the water. Pale, unmoving. At first, they thought it was debris from the feed. But as the surface shifted, the horrifying truth emerged. Fragments of a human body. A torn piece of clothing. A dismembered arm. Panic broke out. Shouts rang through the farm, workers scrambling to confirm what they dreaded most. Deasy Tuwo, dedicated scientist, kind colleague, their friend, was nowhere to be found. The crocodile stared back at them, silent, guarding what remained of her. Its massive body barely moved, as if daring anyone to come closer. In that instant, the farm shifted from routine to nightmare. The pit had become a grave, and Mary, the crocodile she once fed daily, was now both executioner and warden of her final resting place. When co-workers finally gathered the courage to approach the enclosure, the scene before them seared into their memories forever. Mary, the 14-and-a-half-foot crocodile, hovered near the water's edge, his jaws still wet with blood. The surface of the pool rippled, disturbed not only by the reptile's slow movements, but by something else. Something floating just beneath. A shoe. A torn sleeve. Then, as the water shifted, a glimpse of flesh. The workers screamed. Some stumbled back in shock. Others froze, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding in front of them. Bits of Deasy's body, shredded, torn, and incomplete, rose and sank with the water's current. The crocodile, unfazed, circled slowly, almost protectively, as if he knew what he possessed. For the first time, the farm workers saw Mary not as the animal they had grown accustomed to feeding, but as the apex predator he truly was, one whose instincts had claimed their friend's life. It was no accident anymore, no chance misstep. It was brutal, violent reality, and as the realization spread among the team, the weight of what had happened crushed them. They weren't just looking at the aftermath of an attack. They were standing at the very edge of Deasy Tuwo's grave. Authorities arrived at the Pearl Farm to confront the beast. Mary, the colossal crocodile, weighing nearly half a ton, remained in his pool, jaws streaked with the remains of the woman who had fed him for years. The workers who had once tossed meat over the wall now stood back, trembling, unable to meet his gaze. But Mary was no longer just a spectacle. He was evidence, he was danger, and he was a killer. Armed teams closed in with ropes, nets, and tranquilizer guns. Every step toward the pit carried the knowledge that one mistake could mean another death. The crocodile's eyes, unblinking and ancient, followed them. To him, humans weren't caretakers anymore. They were prey circling too close. The shot rang out. A dart pierced his thick hide. The monster thrashed, jaws snapping, tail lashing against the water with a thunderous crack. The pool erupted in violent waves as he fought against the chemical invading his bloodstream. It took minutes, long, agonizing minutes, but eventually, the massive reptile slowed, then sank into a heavy, subdued stillness. Only then could workers approach. Ropes tightened, a crane lifted. Mary was dragged from the pit, his enormous frame swaying above the ground. The killer had been removed, but the void he left behind was filled with silence, grief, and horror. Deasy was gone, devoured by the very creature she had trusted. When Mary was hauled away, the Pearl Farm was left in a state of shock. Workers who had shared breakfast with Deasy just a day earlier now stood beside an empty desk, her belongings untouched, her laughter replaced by silence. The ground near the pit still bore marks of the struggle, a few scraps of clothing, the telltale smear of blood where life had ended in an instant. Police sealed off the enclosure, treating it as both a crime scene and a place of tragedy. Cameras flashed, investigators took notes, and whispers spread through the village. How had a crocodile of such enormous size, an apex predator weighing nearly 1,300 pounds, been allowed to remain in captivity illegally, hidden behind the guise of research? Neighbors spoke of unease. Many had long suspected the farm's pet was more monster than curiosity, but no one had dared to intervene. Now, their worst fears were confirmed. The news exploded across Indonesia. Headlines screamed of the scientist devoured by her own crocodile. Graphic details filtered into living rooms and phones across the world. To outsiders, it was a grisly story of nature's raw power. But to those who knew her, it was the sudden, unbearable loss of a woman whose gentle spirit was extinguished in the most violent of ways. The farm gates, once a workplace of quiet routine, became a place of pilgrimage, where horror and grief mixed, and the memory of Deasy hung heavy in the humid air. Mary, the monstrous crocodile, was no longer just an animal in a pit. He was the living embodiment of a nightmare. After consuming part of Deasy, he lay still in the water, jaws streaked with blood, unblinking eyes fixed on the workers who dared not approach. Authorities knew he could not stay. Armed teams arrived, nets and tranquilizers in hand, but everyone understood the risk. One wrong move, and the beast could surge from the water with terrifying speed. When the dart finally struck, the reptile thrashed with such fury that waves slammed against the walls of the enclosure, a final display of the power that had ended Deasy's life. It took cranes, ropes, and sheer determination to haul the 4.5-meter predator from his concrete prison. Onlookers watched in horrified silence as Mary, bound and sedated, was lifted onto a truck bed like some ancient dragon captured from myth. The decision was swift. Mary would be relocated to a conservation center, far from human reach. Yet whispers lingered. Why should this creature be spared, when it had consumed the woman who fed it? To some, Mary was a killer who deserved death. To others, he was simply nature unleashed, a reminder that wild predators do not bend to human love or control. As the truck rolled away, carrying the crocodile that had taken so much, one truth settled heavy in the air. Mary had lived as he always had, by instinct, by hunger. It was humans who had placed Deasy within his reach. When the dust settled, the Pearl Farm was no longer just a workplace. It was a crime scene of nature's fury. Deasy Tuwo, the gentle scientist who had devoted her life to research and care, was gone. Her final moments a horrifying clash between human fragility and raw prehistoric power. Her colleagues built makeshift memorials by the enclosure's fence. Flowers, candles, trembling notes scrawled on paper damp with tears. Yet every tribute sat in the shadow of the crocodile's pit, a chilling reminder of what had happened there. To stand before it was to confront the brutal truth. One misstep, one slip, and a predator that had survived millions of years would do what it was born to do. The questions lingered, gnawing like teeth. Why was Mary ever kept in a concrete tank at all? Why were safety protocols so lax that a human life could be lost so easily? And what does it say about us, when fascination with power blinds us to the risks it carries? Deasy's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a stark warning. Wild animals are not pets. They are forces of nature. And when that force breaks free, no amount of love or science can stop the outcome. Her story, gruesome, heartbreaking, unforgettable, stands as a testament to the thin, fragile line between admiration and annihilation. And the day Mary dragged her under, that line was crossed forever. Deasy Tuwo's final moments are a grim reminder of what happens when humans step too close to the jaws of nature. One slip, and the predator she cared for became the end of her story. If you found this video powerful, don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring more true stories of humans and animals colliding in the most shocking ways. And stay tuned for our next video, where we dive into another terrifying case you won't believe. Because sometimes, the most dangerous encounters happen where we least expect them.